HP facilities, monitoring, and all of that, that is on the first floor of docking.
Thank you, Representative. I didn't mean to cut you off there. I guess I misread your question. Thank you. All right, this moves us on to our next, thank you very much to the presenters on that. We appreciate that information. And before we cut off to lunch, we have one more presentation. That will be by an update on the Kansas Cybersecurity Task Force. Our presenter is Jeff Maxson, Chief Information Security Officer with the Office of Information Technology Services. Your last. All right, we're ready to go. Thank you for waiting on us.
All right, good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. My name is Jeff Maxson. I am the Chief Information Security Officer here for the state of Kansas. Today, I'm going to give you a brief update on the Kansas Cybersecurity Task Force. The cybersecurity incidents can impact all of Kansas. We're very much aware of that. Recently, we've seen cyber attacks that have impacted our food supply, our fuel supply. They can affect healthcare, delivery of healthcare services, affect continuity of government, as well as a multitude of other things, including financial harm as well. The threats are continuing to grow and become more sophisticated and more damaging in their actions and activities against entities as well as citizens. Recognizing this, the conversation is changing from not if a cybersecurity incident is going to happen, but when. And how do we respond and become resilient and prepare ourselves for those type of events. So on July 13th, the governor signed Executive Order 2125, which established the Kansas Cybersecurity Task Force. The task force was made up of 15 members. As you can see there, it is a cross-section between state government agencies, cross-government, as well as elected officials, and also members of legislative. So I'd like to acknowledge Senator Pittman as well as a valued member and a great contributing member to the task force. Also included in the members is members of critical infrastructure as well. So it is not just a cross-government organization, it does have cross-industry representation as well. So the executive order outlined 8 core charges for the task force, 7 of them being the primary goals and objectives of the task force, with the 8th charge being the deliverables. So the primary goal of the task force really was to identify, cross-government and cross-industry collaboration to better prepare for cybersecurity incidents and better respond, as well as develop our educated workforce, as well as helping fill that needed cybersecurity skills gap for employees as well. So looking at the core charges of the task force, it was best determined that we should work in subcommittees. We identified 4 key subcommittees to work through this task force to identify certain recommendations. The 4 subcommittees are strategic visioning and planning, statewide coordination and collaboration, cyber incident and disruption response, and workforce development and education. So those are really kind of the 4 tenets that we saw as being necessary to carry out the charges of the task force. The first task force meeting was held on August 10th. It was a 2-hour session, and subsequent task force and subcommittee meetings were held every 2 weeks for 2 hours as well. And during those meetings, we had presentation from various stakeholders across the state, as well as discussing recommendations that we see as being viable for the state of Kansas. We partnered with this effort with the National Governors Association and a policy academy to advance the whole state of cybersecurity. They're a valuable partner that has helped provide the national landscape of what other states are doing in this space and provided feedback and as well as consultation recommendations to the task force as well. Again, they have worked through this challenge with many other states and were able to provide a lot of things that got us hitting the ground running very quickly. So the executive order outlined 2 key deliverables. The first one was due to the governor on October 5th. And as you can see, that was a very quick turnaround from the execution of the executive order to the initial recommendations. Again, part of the goal of having the quick turnaround was to identify actionable recommendations that can be provided to her to make sure that we're not so far in the weeds that the things don't get worked on once the recommendations are provided. Recommendations were broken into 2 sections. We focused on near-term recommendations and long-term recommendations. Recommendations that fell into the near-term category were items that could potentially be implemented within 6 months of the recommendation being delivered, and long-terms were anything that were beyond those 6 months. The initial report contained 45 initial recommendations. And again, this is just an interim report. Recommendations will continue to be added upon and refined as the task force continues to meet. During the initial task force meetings and through the development of the initial recommendations, there were several key lessons learned. First one is there is a lot of cybersecurity momentum in the positive direction here in the state of Kansas. There are significant numbers of even state entities that are developing cybersecurity capabilities, as well as a lot of momentum within other stakeholders such as the Regents institutions, critical infrastructure, among several others, also private entities and nonprofits that are really focusing to advance cybersecurity. One of the key lessons and what a lot of the recommendations focus on is leveraging all those efforts and approaching it in a collaborative and coordinated effort. And so again, there's a lot of opportunity to expand on those efforts to better position the state of Kansas as a whole. So next steps for the task force as we continue to meet is we're going to continue hearing from stakeholders. We tend to try and set them up for each of the meetings to have stakeholders, either both the national landscape or entities within the state of Kansas and big Kansas, not just government, to talk about what they're doing. So some of those stakeholders include League of Municipalities, Association of Counties, and those other various associations that represent critical infrastructure as well as other things such as CANRIN, which is the education network backbone for the Regents institutions, among many others. The task force will continue to build and identify new recommendations for the governor to carry out as we continue here, and we'll also work on refining existing recommendations that were in the interim report to identify additional resources that may be needed, potential funding opportunities, and ways to accomplish those recommendations. The Cybersecurity Task Force's final report will be due to the governor on December 5th. And I will stand for questions.
All right, committee. I have one right off the bat, and not to point this in any direction or ask for any detail for clarity, but is the situation with the Department of Labor, is that on the list of recommendations that are going to be given to the governor on December 5th?
No, not specifically. Since this is an open committee, we focused on keeping things that weren't sensitive in nature to address, and identifying specific entities was not something we specifically tackled.
Very good. Thank you. Senator Pittman.
Mr. Chair, I do want to mention, though, that the unemployment modernization, they have two tasks. One is to oversight on the actual systems that are going to be put in place and to go through that RFP process hand in hand with the department. Kind of tedious, I mean, going through all the RFP requirements and understanding that. But part of that is cybersecurity and really addressing that and there's been a lot of emphasis on that. The other thing that they're doing, or we are doing, is putting in place an audit firm to look at how fraud was committed, how much fraud, types of fraud, and the type of cybersecurity gaps that allowed that with recommendations moving forward. So it feels like the cybersecurity task force was more about systematic versus individual incidents like this. So I just want to put a little color commentary from my
I
experience.
appreciate that, and I don't want to drag us down a bunny hole on that because we could probably spend all afternoon on it, but I do appreciate that additional information to it. Thank you. Any other questions by the committee? All right, it looks like everybody's hungry. Thank you for your presentation, your information. All right, committee, that takes care of our business for this morning and into the noon hour. You'll see on our agenda, we come back at 1:45 this afternoon and begin again. So that gives us a little time to get out there. Thank you for your attention this morning. And we stand in recess.
How about that? There we go. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. And thank you for allowing me the chance to be here this afternoon to talk about election security from the perspective of the Kansas Secretary of State's office. So a little background before we get started. On January 6th of 2017, and sorry, my mic is cutting in and out a little bit. Apologize for that. On January 6th of 2017, under the Department of Homeland Security, Secretary Jay Johnson designated election infrastructure as critical infrastructure, making it a priority within the National Infrastructure Protection Plan. This was the first time that elections had been designated as critical infrastructure. This determination has allowed the addition of state, national, and local resources to protect our election systems and processes. As we discuss election security, it is important to consider that from our point of view, security encompasses both systems and processes. It's not just one or both, or one or the other, but we want to look at the global environment of both what we do and the systems that we use. So it is important to remember that, and it's also interesting to remember that we already have processes in law like photo ID and signature verification that speak to the security of the election system. So with that being said, I want to highlight a few efforts that our office is undertaking to enhance election security. The first is the security of the statewide voter registration system. Since the early stages of 2017, the vendor for the statewide voter registration system has partnered with the Department of Homeland Security to enhance the security of that system. This system is of utmost importance, is the backbone of our election system, and constant vigilance must be maintained. In partnership with the vendor, the Secretary of State's office has installed industry-leading security safeguards to access the system in each of the 105 counties. Our office works closely with DHS and the Kansas Fusion Center for ongoing security reviews of that system. We also work with the 105 county election officers to secure their local networks that are used to access the voter registration system. Next, I want to touch on training, particularly as we work to train 105 county election offices. It is a continual challenge for state and local election officials to make sure that we're providing the most up-to-date training and information sharing of cybersecurity threats. We provide ongoing election security training to each of the 105 counties, including training resources that are provided by the Department of Homeland Security, trusted industry leaders, and the Multi-State Information Sharing and Analysis Center, which is a mouthful commonly referred to as MS-ISAC. In 2020, we partnered with the Kansas National Guard, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, commonly known as CISA, DHS, FBI, and the Election Security Initiative. The Secretary of State's office used those resources and provided statewide election security training to all 105 county election offices right before the 2020 primary election. This effort will continue in future election years. I want to touch briefly on the partners we have at both the state and federal level. We work with security partners at every level of government, local, state, and national, to provide the most secure election environment possible. Understanding this is a constant endeavor with new and emerging threats, a continual challenge. With our partners, we review existing frameworks, we explore new strategies and training opportunities to improve our security posture. Upon taking office in 2019, Secretary Schwab became the first Secretary of State in Kansas to obtain the necessary credentials to review classified briefings on threats to election infrastructure. Since that time, the office continues to participate in regularly scheduled briefings with DHS, CISA, FBI, and other members of the intelligence community concerning current and emerging cyber and criminal threats to election systems. In addition to that, the Secretary of State's office works with the Kansas Fusion Center to analyze potential cyber threats against all of the Secretary of State networks. Prior to the last election, the Secretary of State appointed an election security specialist in the office to lead election security initiatives and educate county election officials specifically on election security topics. This position has facilitated increased communication, especially with county IT personnel, which are new relationships that our office has developed. We've provided increased cybersecurity training statewide, and we are assisting counties with securing their own election computers and networks against cyber attacks. We must raise the security posture of every county computing environment, which will lead to safer elections across the state of Kansas. And then the last thing I want to touch on are voting machines. Securing voting machines are of the utmost important part in the whole election process. It has been a long-standing policy of this office that no election machine or tabulator may be connected to the internet. This policy has been in place since 2005. The Secretary of State plans to introduce legislation which will make this policy law in the upcoming legislative session. Additionally, Kansas has multiple safeguards in place, both in state and regulation, to ensure that voting equipment is not subject to tampering or compromise. In Kansas, counties purchase voting equipment, not the state. Counties must purchase voting equipment that is certified by the Secretary of State. The Secretary of State's office relies very heavily on the Federal Election Assistance Commission, the EAC, who certifies voting equipment at the federal level. As part of that process, the EAC contracts with independent testing labs across the country whose sole job is to tear those machines apart and try to break them, forwards, backwards, sideways, upside down. And so before any machines used anywhere, they must pass the ITA test, be certified at the federal level, and then used in the state level. So once that happens, the state will certify it. Then the county is responsible for purchasing any equipment off of the list of equipment that's been certified by us. So again, counties make that purchase. We do require that every computer-based election system in Kansas must have at least these three things. They must have audit data that can track the sequence of events of the system and identify the people initiating those events. Every system must have that. They must have written, well-defined, and strictly enforced policies on who can access the system, under what circumstances they can access it, and how, and what they did when they were on the system, the what. And then lastly, they have to have physical security measures in place to control and limit access to the election equipment every day of the year, not just on election day. So from our perspective, election security is a marathon. It is not a sprint. The Secretary is mindful that election security is a constantly changing environment, and what may have worked in 2020 may not work in the future. The Secretary remains committed to enhancing election security processes and systems in Kansas, and we appreciate your time and consideration, and I'm happy to stand for any questions you may have. Thank you, Chairman.
Very good, thank you. Any questions, committee? Representative Baker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for the presentation. Long time no see. We used to see you quite regularly. So with all the presentation we just heard there and everything, in my mind, I've never ever questioned the results of an election. And with the way this, your statement here that you read, it sounds like you're pretty well convinced that there's not any issues with elections in the state of Kansas. So my local clerks have expressed to me, you know, almost a personal attack they feel like on some of this stuff that's going on. So how do we respond to that when those people ask us about election integrity? Because to my knowledge, we've never had an issue here in the state of Kansas.
Well, we field some of the same calls from constituents, and I'm happy that they're interested. We welcome those conversations because from the state's perspective, these are people who just may not know everything we do to secure the system. And so they may have heard things or read things, and honestly, they just have questions about the process. So we look at it as a good chance to explain what we do. I welcome those questions and calls because we do a lot to secure our election systems. We just don't talk about it very much. And so I don't take it personal. Almost every instance, it's someone that just wants answers, and we want to provide them answers to make them feel as secure as possible that we're doing the best job we can to secure their vote.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Senator Peck.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In looking at your testimony and listening to it, Mr. Caskey, there's some generalities here or some things that are rather vague. You mentioned in the second paragraph about the security of voter registration. You talk about the vendor. More than once, you talk about the vendor. Who is the vendor?
We make it a general policy not to discuss the name of our vendors. in any of our communication. Not that it's a secret, but quite frankly, the less that we the less information we share with our adversaries about who we use and what systems we use, the better, strictly from a point of view of, this is a nationally known election services company. They're used in lots of states, but we just try to protect as much information as we can from getting into the hands of people who wish us harm. And so I'm happy to share that. It's not a secret, but we purposely generally don't talk about the names of our vendors in a public setting.
Well, I agree with Representative Baker. I personally haven't had any issues or concerns with election integrity in the state of Kansas, but most of us as legislators are getting calls for a forensic audit, and that is one of the things. It's like, well, they don't know who the vendor is. And then down toward the bottom, you talk about security partners, but you don't name any of the security partners. I may get the same answer from you. If I am going to, I guess you can just do the Rush Limbaugh thing and say ditto. But
I will be happy to share that information with you after this hearing is over.
And two more brief things, Mr. Chairman. I don't understand the statewide voter registration system. I guess I thought that if I registered, I live in Montgomery County, if I moved to Labette County and registered in Labette County, I guess I thought that the Labette County clerk would then send the Secretary of State's office something that says Virgil Peck is registered in Labette County, no longer Montgomery. But is it some kind of a system that all counties can access, or can you, without spending a lot of time, can you mention this, elaborate on the statewide voter registration system?
Yes, keeping in mind that the purpose of this committee is as a security committee, but to get to your question, we have a statewide voter registration system that each of the 105 counties accesses. So in the situation you just mentioned, the new county would transfer your old voter registration into the new registration, and you wouldn't have to do anything. That takes place via a voter registration system that each of the counties use.
And then the final question, again, on the back, you talk about the secretary has appointed an election security specialist, and this is an unnamed person, or do they not have a name?
He does have a name, and he works in my office, and so yes, he has a name. I'll be happy to share it with that. I'll be happy to share his name with you after this hearing.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Cluse.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Could you briefly just update me on what the difference is with the audit data here that you're saying concerning the voting machines, and what the difference is between that and some of what the other states are calling for in the forensic audits, or is there a difference?
It's a hard question to answer because it depends on what other states, what term that uses. So within Kansas, there's no definition of a forensic audit. In Kansas, what we're trying to say with this information is that we keep track of every keystroke of every computer that touches voting machines. Like you do ballot programming, you do ballot tabulation. So the computers that do that, we audit, meaning we track every single keystroke, who made that keystroke, when they made it, and were they allowed to do that. So that's what our systems are required to do. I'm just not sure I can compare that with the phrase forensic audit, especially as it relates to other states.
Go ahead.
The second one kind of comes to what was done differently, or what is being done differently. There seemed to be some kind of an issue in Shawnee County that happened with some data. Could you elaborate a little bit on that and what changes have been made?
Pardon me for a minute. You may have to give me a little bit more information. So you're saying there's a data problem in Shawnee County?
Wasn't there, to my recollection, that there was some data that wasn't poured in until later, something about a chip or something?
Okay, so in the 2020 general election in Shawnee County, one of the memory chips that was in a voting machine out in one of the polling places was unaccounted for when it came back. So
And what does that mean, unaccounted for?
so you have X number of chips that belong to each machine where the votes are actually stored on at the polling place on election day. When the election office checks those out, they know exactly who received the memory chip and where it goes and who's supposed to bring it back. So at the end of the night, one of those was missing. And so the election office temporarily stopped what they were doing to find that chip. They found it. It ended up being a chip that was a backup that did not have any data on it, but they stopped the tabulation at that point to make sure that they could account for the location of those memory chips coming back in. So there was no data loss, there was no data on that chip, but it's just part of their procedure. Always account for everything, every step along the way. And so that's what happened in the 2020 general election there in Shawnee County. You bet.
Representative Baker, for a second.
Thank you for a second time, Mr. Chairman. So I'm just struggling a little bit here with some of this because, number one, I didn't know we ever had a problem. And then I see this in here where it says leads to safer elections for the entire state. I didn't know we had a problem. And so in defense of my clerks, and where I live in a small county and trying to find county employees is always a challenge. And then when we beat the clerk up with these things, that's kind of a tough one. So I guess my question is, and I know the secretary, and he's one of the people I've admired in the legislature since I've gotten here. Should we just refer all these questions to your office?
Well, it's not that simple because unfortunately the county election officers are the front line of our security posture. It's the county that processes voter registration applications. It's the county where voters come in and cast their votes. It's the county that counts those votes and sends it to the state. So the counties have to be at the front lines of our security system, and our security is only as good as each of the 105 counties make it. So I completely understand what you're saying, and we are providing as many resources at the state and national level as there are, but we have to have the counties. Like, quite frankly, their job's more important than ours is when it comes to the security posture of our election systems.
Just in closing, so that word safer elections is where my heartburn is. I didn't know we had a problem. I've never known us to have a problem. We've gone through this in the past, no problem. And then we have that statement, safer elections, which casts doubt that there may have been a problem in the past. And I can tell you some of the constituents that I've talked to in that realm, they're almost taking that personally, and I don't blame them. I would too. And in your office, you guys have done a great job over there, and this really doesn't taste very good, and I'm disappointed to see that word in there. Thank you.
If I might invite, there's a couple of folks in here from the Association of County Clerks and Election Officials. Rick, do you have any comments? I would say your last name, but I know I would murder it, so. Well, you can come forward in case any of ours do. Also, Tina Spencer, if you'd like to come up. These folks work directly through county clerks and election officials, so if any of the committee has questions directly for them about their perceptions, especially if Representative Baker alludes to, the personal mission that county clerks feel is under scrutiny right now. If you could address that, maybe give us an idea. Yeah, Rick, could you give us your last name?
My last name is Pifo.
Pifo. All right, very good.
Tina Spencer. I'm the Marion County Clerk, and this year I'm the president of our statewide association for county clerks and election officials. And I will say that I think one of the biggest obstacles in our job recently has been mistrust, misinformation, and a lot of people just not understanding how many steps that we do have to take to secure our elections. And on the question that you had earlier, as far as safer elections, I think that the Secretary of State's office and most all of our clerks I mean, I won't speak for everyone, but personally, I think we can always improve from where we are. So anytime that something comes along that is a tool that we can use just to make it better, I don't think using that word says that we've had a problem, but just that we're always striving to improve and to consider things that we've never thought about before. Because more and more, you learn as you go along. And in the 2020 election cycle, amidst the global pandemic and all of the challenges that we had, personally in my county, we had 78% voter turnout, and we had 400 times more people decide to vote by mail than in the past because they weren't comfortable coming to the polling location. We also had a lot of people that came to the courthouse and voted early, and then people that did choose to go to the poll site, and those poll workers had extra duties as far as making sure that people could do that, come and vote safely. And so I think that that's something that was a huge challenge, and it was done well all across the state of Kansas. And we do have the things in place to make sure that people can vote securely in that way, whether they vote in person or by mail. So that was
one of the things that I've spoken to my county clerk about some and others is the idea that we call this the information age. I call it the misinformation age, right? We're constantly trying to vet out information, and part of that vetting out is the people out there hearing stories about the election. You folks are the ones they're going to come to, right? And it's going to sound accusatory and and sometimes it is very accusatory. I understand that, and that's not fair. But certainly when we are asked as government officials to declare a transparency of our actions and those things that we oversee, when we pull back away from that and say we don't want to give full disclosure, there seems to be an onslaught, right? And now that's, I think, in my opinion, and seeing what I'm seeing and talking to my constituents, that's what we're seeing. And you, unfortunately, are getting the point of that attack. Representative Owsley, you had a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you both for being here. And Brian, I apologize for walking in late on your presentation. I worked pretty extensively on the post-election audit bill that was passed, and I'm curious how that's going for you. And to the mistrust, is that helping gain any trust back from the public when you're performing those audits? And I know some of my colleagues said, Jared, why are you working so hard on this? What are you going to do when the audits come back and they just say they were good? I said, then I'm going to encourage people to vote, and you're going to know your vote was counted the way it was cast. Is that helpful at all? Is it hindering?
Do you want to? Okay. I believe it is helpful. We have a lot of steps that we do before the election to test all of our equipment and our programming to make sure everything functions correctly. And then we go through, that's all open to the public. And then we go through the whole election process of people voting and us tabulating the votes. And when we're tabulating, that's also open to the public. They can come and they cannot be in the room. And in my particular county, they're not in the room, but they can watch what we're doing. And then just having that extra layer there where somebody actually comes in and our board, the audit board comes in and actually checks the work of myself and my staff. I think it's a good thing.
Thank you for that. And then maybe more a question for Brian. I know when we were working through that with then Secretary Kobach, one of the main points that was wanted out of that bill was open source software in our machines. Is there any federally approved open source software polling machine?
That's a great question. I'm not aware of any, but I won't swear to it, mainly because there are none that are certified in Kansas. And so if they exist, those companies have not come to Kansas yet to get their machines certified. I'm not aware of any, but it's possible they just haven't come to Kansas yet.
It just seems like that could be another step in gaining the public trust, that not only are our workers open and transparent and our process is open and transparent, but also our machines are one step closer to being secure. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you all.
Very good. Do we have any other questions for these conferees? Doesn't look like it. Thank you very much for being here, and thank you for the information.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right, committee, our next conferees is an overview of the Firstnet and government emergency telecommunication systems. It looks like Jason Bryant is our presenter, and he's via WebEx. Is that correct?
He is on WebEx. Jason, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Okay, we can hear you in here.
Okay. Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and committee members. My name is Jason Bryant. I'm the Statewide Interoperability Coordinator for the state of Kansas. Today, I will be giving you an update on 2 of our emergency communications technologies. Starting off with, it'll be the Government Emergency Telecommunications Service, also known as GETS. The Department of Homeland Security Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency service. This service provides priority service during congestion for landline and as well as wireless. So in essence, what the service provides is for first responders, companies, agencies, federal to the local level, the ability to have a priority in the network during major events or disasters where congestion is typical, especially on landline service. On here, I've also updated our registered cards throughout Kansas. I can go through the numbers. On the federal side, there's 131 registered cards in the state, 549 state official or agency cards issued, 1,874 that have been issued to local public safety entities, agencies, or individuals. On the commercial side, 681, nonprofit is 536, and tribal is 1. I'm currently working with the regional coordinator from DHS CISA on working towards a public safety announcement to work towards those numbers gaining a little bit. We have had those drop over the years, and it's something that CISA is very adamant about, as well as myself, getting the word out and making sure that those that have the capability to register do. Next on the list is Firstnet. Quick overview. In the response to the 9/11 Commission, following the communications failure that occurred during the 9/11 attacks, the Firstnet Authority was brought forth through Spectrum. So what happened was they determined that they wanted a nationwide public safety network, specifically just for public safety for interoperability. They determined a frequency band, which was band 14. And from there, they put out an RFP, which AT&T was later selected for that private partnership. And it's a 25-year public-private partnership with the federal government through the request for proposal process. Firstnet is purpose-built to favor the important work first responders do. And it's the only interoperability wireless network in the country, platform specific for public safety usage. Band 14 is nationwide. It's in what they consider a very high quality spectrum set, because it has a capability to not only push massive amounts of data, but also has a better range and penetration capability due to the frequency set. During emergency, this band can be cleared and locked just for FirstNet subscribers, public safety officials, or those responders within an affected area. Next slide. FirstNet, where we're at today in working with AT&T, You can see Barber, Brown, Clark, Comanche, Donovan, Greeley, Jackson, Jefferson, Logan, Sherman, Smith, and Thomas all have had new sites installed based on the information from public safety stakeholders and the team that was put together to work with AT&T directly on where we felt that we needed coverage expansion based on AT&T's network. Now, existing sites, Band 14 was added to existing sites and will continue, but as of this time, those markets include Brown, Edwards, Elk, Ellsworth, Franklin, Hamilton, Hodgman. I should say Douglas, not Lawrence, but it is also the Lawrence Metro or City, Marshall, Morris, Reno, Topeka, Shawnee County, Trego County, and Wichita. Those are sites that have been expanded on from the commercial network that already pre-existed for coverage on this network. New sites that cover or serving tribal is Iowa, Kickapoo, Prairie Band, Potawatomi Nation, and the Sac and Fox Nation. I believe that the last one was Prairie Band, Potawatomi Nation to service that area north of Shawnee County. From 2018 to 2020, Firstnet expanded coverage and improved connectivity in more communities by investing more than $550 million in Firstnet wireless and wireline networks in Kansas. Now on to challenges. Our primary challenge focus within the state of Kansas and working with AT&T has been that Verizon holds currently about 90% of the market share for public safety broadband needs and has historically been the primary vendor of choice. For this reason, FirstNet adoption in public safety has been slow, but is gaining as agencies test AT&T's offering, as well as look at the coverage need within their community or county. That's all I have. And if there's any questions, I'd be happy to answer.
Thank you, Mr. Bryant. Committee, any questions for Senator Peck?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I apologize. I got lost way back. Well, and then I got found again. But on the registered cards, are we talking about like a SIM card? Or what is a card on the very first page?
Yes, sir. It is it looks like a credit card and it has a number on it. And that number gives you access into, as a priority customer within whatever phone you're operational off of, whether it's a IP-based business phone or a landline phone at a home or otherwise. Wherever you can get a dial tone, there's a set of numbers on this credit card that's been issued with your specific number to give you access or priority service within within that telecommunications.
Okay, well, I appreciate that answer. That I don't necessarily need an answer, but it raises some questions as to why some of these commercial and nonprofit would have those particular cards, but that's not really vital to me at this time as long as I know what the cards are.
I actually have a card with me. When you put in for one of these, as the undersheriff, I put in for all our deputies, our jailers, our dispatchers, and those that we might need to get a hold of in the event of a catastrophe or something like that. So it's just a simple, it looks like a calling card, but it gives you a code to use when you tap in. Those are the cards that are being issued.
So are those, Mr. Chairman, limited to just the card holders for you to call just certain card holders, or?
No, I'd be able to link to anybody that can actually get on the network or get on the provider to receive a phone call. And also I can share this number with certain individuals under emergency conditions. So it's not just the card holders themselves, but it obviously is going to enhance our communication capability under those circumstances.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Any other questions? I show him that card and I tell him that, I have some knowledge about this, but I got to tell you, I have a hard time with the nexus between FirstNet and GETS. Can you tell me what the difference is, or is there a connection there? How do they work together or separately?
Yes, FirstNet is a priority. It is confusing. So FirstNet is a broadband service that AT&T is currently operating, and won the contract on. So it is a broadband service like your cell phone. It's actually identical to what everybody carries as a cell phone. That gives public safety the priority and preemptive access to the network during emergencies. What GETS does is the exact same thing, but gives you access in a landline function or over a cell-to-cell function. So just because a public safety official has a FirstNet phone doesn't really give them access into the landline on the call. It gives them priority access to the cell system, but not into the connection into a business, a home, things like that. So what GETS does is gives you the backward capability out to another number. I hope that makes sense. So if you're picking up your desk phone and want to make a priority call, you can using the GETS function, or you can pick up a FirstNet device if you have one and do the same thing over the cellular network. It gives the public safety official that priority access to the network. And so they kind of work hand in hand in a way, especially if a cell user on FirstNet and a GETS user on a landline need to communicate with each other. They both can end up with priority on their specific networks until they connect somewhere in the IP world.
I'm going to be able to retain a piece of that, but I am probably, the whole committee is probably not as interested as I am in the rest of that nexus, but I'll get back to my provider to make sure I understand that at some point, unless someone has further questions about that. Doesn't look like it. Well, Mr. Bryant, thank you very much for your presentation.
Thank you.
All right. We do have a little time before our next presentation. We can go ahead and move ahead if Heidi, Ms. Zimmerman, if you're ready, Principal Auditor with Legislative Division of Post Audit. This will be on school districts' IT security practices, and this is an open hearing.
Good afternoon. Okay, so this is the limited scope audit of the K-12 IT security. The audit has a single question. It's what do school districts report regarding IT security standards and resources? I'll give you the really brief answer, and then I'll circle back and give you a little bit of detail and some background. So the very brief answer to the audit question is that many school districts have not implemented basic IT security controls. And so a little bit of background starts on page 2 of the report. The school districts maintain a variety of sensitive and confidential data on students. And that includes some of the obvious things like grades and disciplinary actions. The districts also maintain information such as medical and mental health records and financial information. But school districts also face many threats that could result in an unauthorized person accessing that confidential data. That can include things like a data breach, phishing scams, or ransomware attacks. And these kinds of attacks on school districts have increased in recent years. In March of 2021, the K-12 Cybersecurity Resource Center reported an 18% increase in IT security incidents in school districts over the previous year. Additionally, a 2020 Government Accounting Office report noted that large and affluent school districts had disproportionately more reported data breaches than smaller school districts. And so while those school districts maintain sensitive and confidential data, Kansas districts, though, are not required to implement any specific IT controls. So there are state and federal laws that restrict who has access to student data. So for example, the federal Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, which is also referred to as FERPA, requires written permission from a guardian to release information in the student's educational record. The Kansas Student Data Privacy Act also restricts who districts and the Department of Education can release student data to. But neither law requires districts to implement any specific IT security controls to prevent unauthorized access to that data. There are also state laws that require state agencies to adopt certain IT security controls, but those laws do not apply to school districts. And further, the Department of Education does not require districts to implement anything specific either. So districts have requirements to protect data, but they have no requirements for how to protect that data. So I'm going to move on to kind of the detailed answer for the question, and I'm on page 3. We sent surveys to all 286 school districts and the Kansas Schools for the Deaf and the Blind, and we asked them to report on the practices their districts have currently implemented across several IT security control areas. 51% responded. And given that reasonably high response rate, we think that the results are likely representative of districts statewide, but returning the survey was voluntary, and that can introduce some self-selection bias. So districts, like I mentioned before, districts are not required to implement any specific controls, but there are a number of basic controls that are good practices, and we asked districts about some of those good basic controls. What we found was that the majority of school districts reported lacking several of those basic IT security controls. If you look on page 4, the figure provides some detail to a few of the control areas we asked about. As you can see there, 58% do not require security awareness training for their staff at any time. Standards suggest that staff should attend security awareness training when they're hired, and then again annually. 59% of districts told us they do not require confidential data to be encrypted when sending it outside their network. All confidential data should be encrypted anytime it's sent outside the network. 65% told us they do not scan their computer systems for vulnerabilities as often as they should. And that includes 35% of districts that reported never scanning their computer network. Standards suggest that organizations scan their networks at least monthly. And last, 69% told us they do not have an incident response plan. Without a plan, the risks are much greater that an organization will not recognize and respond to a security incident quickly and effectively. We also found that small school districts, so a small school district is a district with 500 or fewer kids, we found that those districts lag behind large districts in implementing some of these security controls. And a large school district is a district with 3,000 or more kids. So 67% of small districts reported having antivirus installed on all of their computers. In contrast, 80% of large districts did. 33% of small districts reported scanning their computers at least monthly, but 55% of large school districts do so. We also asked districts to rate the significance of various barriers to implementing adequate IT security controls. I'm on page 5. The figure on the bottom there shows again the details of that question. And as you can see, staff-related issues were the most significant barriers. About half of the districts reported that their ability to hire sufficient IT staff or to pay them competitively were significant barriers. Districts reported some other difficulties to us as well. Several reported that the lack of guidance from the state was problematic. A few also reported that it's difficult to get staff to implement security practices because they are viewed as inconvenient. We also interviewed several stakeholders, including the Department of Education, a service center, a private company that provides IT services to districts, and a number of school districts. Every person that we talked to reported that a lack of knowledge or training was a significant challenge that they faced. Most of them also reported that guidance from the state would help them better implement IT security controls. However, a couple thought that imposing requirements could be met with some resistance. We also asked districts to estimate their IT security expenditures. On average, districts reported spending about $18 per student. In comparison, districts spend a total of a little more than $16,000 per student. We looked for national benchmarks for IT security expenditures in school districts, but we didn't find any. And as a result, we can't say whether the expenditures districts reported are really reasonable or not. But we should note here that the federal government provided additional funding to school districts to help offset expenditures related to COVID. The federal government allows school districts to use that funding for certain IT security activities. The last finding is on page 7. We identified 3 states that require school districts to implement specific IT security controls. Due to time constraints, though, we could not do a comprehensive search of all 50 states, but we did identify a few. So first of all, New Hampshire and New York. Both of those states require their departments of education to establish minimum IT security standards. We also found that Texas requires its districts to adopt a cybersecurity policy and also requires them to designate someone as a cybersecurity coordinator. We made one recommendation. It's on page 7. That recommendation is to the Kansas Legislature, and that the Legislature should consider directing the Department of Education to establish a set of minimum IT security standards for school districts in the form of either guidance or requirements. And that concludes my audit presentation. I'd be happy to stand for any questions.
Senator Ware.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. There's a little bit of confusion in my mind between what I'm seeing partly on page 2 and then part of page 4. On 2, you said the accounting office reported that large and affluent districts had disproportionately more data breaches than smaller. And yet then on page 4, and maybe this isn't contradictory, maybe I'm just not seeing into it far enough, 67% say that the large districts have more antivirus installed.
Well, antivirus and a data breach aren't necessarily the same thing. You can have great antivirus protection and still have data breaches because that's not there are other controls that you also need. And so just having that alone might not be enough. I will say that the GAO report, which is the report that indicated that it's the large affluent districts that are being essentially targeted more, that was a kind of a nationwide report. Ours is looking specifically at Kansas. It is possible there's a little disconnect there. But the large affluent districts are typically the districts that have the most data. And so because they are larger districts, which seems to be what may make them a little more of an attractive target for someone.
Other questions? I don't see any from anyone else. I think my questions are answered in your write-up here, so thank you very much for your presentation. Okay, we're going to move ahead. We're still ahead of schedule, and that's a good thing. Do we have, I'm looking at the WebEx, and there are a couple of conferees that I think we're going to be on WebEx that haven't arrived. It could be just because we're early. Take a look here through my notes. I think we'll move ahead, but we're gonna take it out of order a bit. Katrina Alsterhaus, if this will be a closed session, so I'm going to have only those members present who are part of this presentation. And that would include the members, members from Wichita State online can stay there. We'll have to, as she says, move us into another room on WebEx so that we can do this in a closed session and they can still participate. In order to do this, we'll need a motion. Mr. Vice Chair, do you have the motion? Ms. Osterhaus, do you know how much time you might need? 5 and 10 minutes? And I'm thinking for questions, we're probably going to at least put 25 minutes. We're going to put 25 minutes on this. If I'm wrong, then we've got a long period of awkwardness. But so if we do that, let's see, 57:12 would be 3:12 p.m. is what I'm seeing for 25 minutes. Yes, you have a comment?
Just a warning that you might have some awkwardness.
Okay. Do we want to back that off? Do you? Okay. Yeah, we'll go back into it if we need to then. She thinks 5 to 10 minutes, so let's go 15 minutes, and if we do that, then we're looking at 2:52 p.m., 2:53 p.m., let's say 2:53 p.m. Apparently not. He's the one saying we don't need much time. I know, yeah, so. I'm ready. Sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move the open meeting of the Joint Committee on Kansas Security be recessed for a closed executive meeting pursuant to KSA 75-413-19A to discuss matters related to security measures to protect a public facility pursuant to KSA 75-43-19B-12C because discussion of such matters in an open meeting would jeopardize such security measures that the committee resume the open meeting in room 582 north of the State House at 2:53. And this motion, if adopted, be recorded in the minutes of the Joint Committee on Kansas Security and be maintained as part of the permanent records of the committee.
We have a motion. Do I have a second? Senator Pittman, second. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed? It is passed. We are in executive session. None. we can go ahead and declare it an open session at this point. All right, let's go ahead and get started, folks. This next session will also be a closed session. Vice Chair, do you have a motion?
Yes, I do. Do we know?
Mr. Guard? Well, how much time do you think you need? And we'll try to guesstimate how many questions we'll have. Right around 8 minutes. So if we went 15 minutes total, that would be. Yeah, that's what I'm thinking. Okay. Do you want to go 15 minutes? Yeah, let's go till 3:15 p.m. That'll give you time.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move the open meeting of the Joint Committee on Kansas Security be recessed for a closed executive meeting pursuant to KSA 754319A to discuss matters related to security measures to protect the information system of a public agency. Pursuant to KSA 754319B12C, because discussion of such matters in an open meeting would jeopardize such security measures, that the committee resume the open meeting in room 582 north of the State House at 3:15 p.m. And in this motion, if adopted, be recorded in the minutes of the Joint Committee on Kansas Security and maintained as part of the permanent records of the committee.
Committee, you've heard the motion. Do I have a second? Senator Ware, seconds. All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? It passes. We are in executive session. We're back in open session, and I would ask the committee if they have a desire to continue the closed session. I'm not gonna force it just on the question that I have. But if there are others, I'd be willing to move back into it if you'd like to. Is there any discussion on that? Well, on that, why don't we go ahead and move back in? I'm going to give it, we'll say 7 minutes. So if we did it now, it'd be 3:23. Yeah, okay, go ahead. They are. Perhaps. It depends on the nature of the questions. Okay. You have the motion? Yeah.
Mr. Chairman, I move the open meeting of the Joint Committee on Kansas Security be recessed for a closed executive meeting pursuant to KSA 754319A to discuss matters related to security measures to protect the information system of a public agency pursuant to KSA 754319B12 because of direction of such matters and discussion of such matters in an open meeting would jeopardize such security measures, that the committee resumed the open meeting in room 582 north of the State House at 1523, and that motion, that if this motion is adopted, be recorded in the minutes of the Joint Committee on Kansas Security and be maintained as part of the permanent records of the committee.
Do I have a second on the motion? Senator Cluse? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? We are back in executive session. All right, folks, we're moving back into open session on this part. And that completes our hearing on KDADs. The next portion of this hearing will be for the Department of Revenue. And it will also have to be a closed session. So does the vice chair have a motion? Similar amount of time, 20? All right, let's go with 20 minutes then. So if we go with 20 minutes, I have 3:24 now. I'll say 3:25 by the time you're done reading, giving us 3:45 p.m.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move the open meeting of the Joint Committee on Kansas Security be recessed for the closed executive meeting pursuant to KSA 754319A to discuss matters related to security measures to protect the information system of a public agency. Pursuant to KSA 754319B12C, because discussion of such matters in an open meeting would jeopardize such security measures, that the committee resume the open meeting in 582 North of the State House at 15:45, and that this motion, if adopted, be recorded in the minutes of the Joint Committee on Kansas Security and be maintained as part of the permanent records of the committee.
That is the motion. Do I have a second? Senator Pittman, all in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed, same sign. It is passed. We are in executive session. Sir, can you identify yourself, please? Very good. Thank you very much. Okay, we're ready to proceed. can bring in staff for an open session. Yeah. Well, certainly, we've gotten some food for thought for tomorrow in our discussions. We're done for today. We'll talk about tomorrow a little bit. We are scheduled to come in at 9 a.m. and begin with our first conferee then. We'll hear reports from KBI, Department of Labor. Let's see. That's it. That's who we hear from tomorrow morning, and then we'll have a chance to discuss some of this stuff. Any thoughts by the committee before we get out of here? Senator Pittman.
Just one question, really. It's my first time on here. I really enjoy being appointed to this committee, and thank you for being our chair. Is there any output that we have to come up with directly, kind of statutorily? Do we have to come up with recommendations or some kind of a report or anything like that tomorrow?
So we will have a report, obviously, that we'll come up with at the end of this. We don't have anything we have to come up with except for, I'm sorry. Okay. We have a statutory requirement on the funding. We had to hear that. So besides that, we don't have to make any recommendations on it. Staff will give their input.
There also is a statutory requirement for a report by the end of the year. This is Jill Shelley with Legislative Research. So the conclusions and recommendations you develop tomorrow will be part of that report.
So tomorrow we will have an opportunity to discuss what type of recommendations we might have as a committee to put forward. Okay. Anything else? We're adjourned.